G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I'll let you in on a secret. I grew up wanting to be a fighter pilot, and like a lot of wannabe fighter pilots, I spent a lot of time pondering the allegedly vital question of who is or was the world's most successful fighter pilot. Not necessarily the greatest fighter pilot in terms of kills scored, but the most successful fighter pilot. Who was that? And how do you judge? What are the criteria? Well, according to Derek Robinson in his book Goshawk Squadron, one of the criterion or the definition of a successful fighter pilot is somebody who sneaks up on his enemy and shoots him in the back and then buggers off before his victim's mates figure it out and come looking for revenge. So let's just say that you can't be in the running as a successful fighter pilot if you die during the war that you're fighting. Because the essence of success as a fighter pilot is to live. So a character like Manfred von Richthofen, 80 victories in the First World War, not in the running because he died in combat. And of course there is one other criterion when judging the success or otherwise of a fighter pilot, apart from how many enemy aircraft they have shot down. And that is how many times they were shot down. How much damage did their aircraft sustain? How much damage from enemy action did they cause their government to have to pay for? You lose your aircraft, your government provides you with a new one. You've just cost your taxpayers one aircraft that you lost in combat. So let's have a look at the first reference book, Air Races by Christopher Shores, which has some handy dandy ready reckoning lists. Like top scoring pilots of World War II in all theatres. And there's never going to be a war in which the government of any country puts up as many aircraft for fighter pilots to shoot down as occurred in the Second World War. So the world's best, the world's most successful fighter pilot is going to emerge from the Second World War. British Commonwealth, Marmaduke St John Pattle, 40 plus victories, but as you see by the asterisk, Pattle died in battle. There, but for the worms, go with what would be the most successful British fighter pilot of the Second World War. Which brings us to Johnnie Johnson with 38 kills, 38 victories. He survived his war. And here's an interesting point. During all his operational tours, his aircraft was only hit once by a single shell from an opposing aircraft. 38 enemy aircraft downed, one shot hit his aircraft. Now that is a seriously good fighter pilot. The top scoring surviving American fighter pilot only downed 34 aerial victories. And I don't know how many times his aircraft was hit. I don't know how many times he crash landed. I don't know how many times he force landed. Now let's look at the German fighter pilots. And bear in mind, they learnt to fly on gliders. The Allied pilots learnt to fly on powered aircraft. You learn to fly on gliders. Forever afterwards, you fly the wing. And the Germans had a night fighter ace who shot down 3 times more victories at night time than the top scoring Allied ace shot down during the day. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, 121 victories, and unlike the next 2 highest scoring German night fighters, he survived the war. By comparison, the top scoring night fighter pilot of the RAF, 21 victories. And in the daytime, there's Erich Hartmann, 352 witnessed confirmed victories, and he survived the war. In fact, the top 3 German fighter pilots, Gerhard Barkhorn, Gunther Roll and Erich Hartmann, all survived the war, having shot down 1,000 enemy aircraft between them. In fact, slightly more than that. Okay, so in terms of shoot downs, Erich Hartmann, world's greatest ace. A great dogfighter, master of the hit and run tactic, his total included 260 fighters, 7 of them P-51s, for he had met the Americans again in April 1945. On his best day, he claimed 11 victories, 4 of them in one sortie. But he had crash landed 12 times and once bailed out in the course of over 800 operational sorties, though only twice were these the result of enemy action. So 12 crash landings and 1 bailout, that means he lost 13 aircraft. And one of his crash landings, when he was shot down during August 1943, he came down in Soviet territory and was taken prisoner for a few hours, and then he had to escape and wait for the German army to advance around him in order to get back to his squadron. 352 victories divided by 13 aircraft that he lost, 27. So every time Bobby Hartman shot down 27 Soviet aircraft or American aircraft, the Führer had to give him a whole new fighter plane because he broke the old one. 27 for 1. As against Johnnie Johnson, 38 for 1 bullet hole. But there was somebody who was even better than that. Just forget about the top scoring Luftwaffe fighter pilots, and let's have a little bit of a look at the top scoring Finnish pilots of the continuation war, which is what they call World War II. Major Erich Juutilainen, Juutilainen, 92 plus 2 1/6, 94 1/6 victories. So here's Christopher Shaw's brief bio. When Russia attacked Finland in late 1939, Ilmari Juutilainen, Ilu to his friends, was an experienced NCO pilot approaching his 25th birthday, flying Fokker D-21 monoplanes with the country's leading fighter squadron, LELV-24. He was credited with 2 individual and 1 shared victories during December, but had no further chance to add to his score until before the fighting ceased in March 1940. The resumption of hostilities in June 1941 found his unit re-equipped with Brewster 239s, the famous or infamous Buffalo, an aircraft with which the crack pilots of LELV-24 were to achieve wonders. In the next 6 months, he was to claim 13 victories over Soviet aircraft, twice getting 3 in a day. The year 1942 saw the I-153s and I-16s giving way to more modern types such as the MiG-3 and PE-2 and Lend-Lease Hurricanes, Tomahawks, and so on. Some further 20 victories were credited to him during the year, and he received the first award of the Mannerheim Cross, Finland's highest decoration. In March 1943, he joined the new LELV-34, formed to fly the first Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs received, and with this improved equipment, he had claimed a further 18 victories by the end of 1943 to raise his total to 52 in the present war. 5 successes in the early months of 1944 were followed by 21 more in June, as the country fought for its very existence as the Russians launched their summer offensive. This total included 4 on the 10th, 5 on the 20th, and 6th on the 30th. This best day yielding 2 Yak-9s, 2 Aerocobras, an LA-5 and an IL-2 to make him top scorer. He added a further 11 victories in the first 6 days of July before fighting tailed off as the Russians withdrew units to the Central Front. With a second Mannerheim Cross received at the end of June, he claimed 1 more Yak-9 on 15 July and then an Li-2 transport aircraft on the 3rd of September 1944, the last Finnish victory against the Russians, to bring his total score in 2 wars to 94 1/6, officially. Okay, time to change references. We move to Aeroplane Monthly, February 2015. Official tally of confirmed kills was 94 1/6, but a number for which he was not credited were assigned to his squadron instead. The final figure was well over 100. But what made Ilu Juutilainen so successful? How did he survive all those aerial engagements, 437 combat sorties in all, without ever sustaining any damage from enemy fighters? Somewhere between 94 and 100 kills by one person, without ever sustaining any damage from any bullets fired by enemy fighters. I figure on points he's 3 times better than Erich Hartmann, who lost 13 aeroplanes. One perspective comes from retired US Navy fighter pilot Rear Admiral Paul T. Gilchrist. He sums up the essential attributes thus: attack, attack, attack. The advantage always lies with the attacker. Superb situational awareness, good lookout doctrine, and incredibly good eyesight. A superb ability to estimate deflection, a natural shooter. A solid knowledge of his own airplanes, strengths and weaknesses, as well as those of his enemies, and the ability to capitalize on them both. A gifted natural pilot, a willingness to fly his airplane out to the ragged edge of its capabilities, and the natural ability to sustain the fight at the edge of the envelope. Great physical endurance under extremely harsh circumstances, supreme confidence in his own abilities and coolness under fire. One could go into each of these characteristics in greater detail and find oneself describing the ideal fighter pilot. There has probably never been any such person in the history of aerial combat. However, this writer's view is that Juutilainen comes as close to such perfection as anyone whom he has ever known or heard. Countless times during his memoirs, the reader notices that in the heat of an intense aerial engagement, Ilmari Juutilainen would take one last look around just prior to starting his final pass for a kill, especially directly behind. If an attacker were threatening his position, he would always break off and turn his attention to that aggressor. That's Ilmari Juutilainen on the right. This one habit, above all, was the reason why no other pilot scored a hit against Juutilainen or any of his aircraft in battle. His firing distances, incidentally, varied from 20 to 100 yards. That Ilu was an eminently successful fighter pilot goes without question. That he was deadly in an aerial engagement is demonstrated by his having downed over 94 enemy fighters without enemy aircraft, without receiving any damage from other fighters whatsoever. But he was neither vicious nor cruel. He lacked neither gallantry nor even magnanimity. He had feelings of empathy for his opponents and often wished them well after having put their aircraft out of action. He was involved in a raw, brutal, terrifying business, the pitting of men in flying machines against each other. No quarter was asked and none given, yet many of the participants relished it and came back for more day after day. These were the victorious knights. Air Master Sergeant Ilmari Ilu Juutilainen was surely one of the best such men. I had the pleasure of meeting Ilu in person at his home in 1997. I found him to be a modest and yet very lively individual. He took part actively in the meetings of veterans right up until his death in 1999. Ilu once stated that he would pass away on his birthday, and that, aged 85, is exactly what he did. There he is, third from the right in front of a Brewster Buffalo. An English translation from the book Juutilainen wrote. On that day, we scrambled in response to air surveillance information that a large formation of enemy aircraft was approaching about 3 miles northwest of Seppala Lighthouse. We made a visual sighting. We found that the formation included PE-2 dive bombers and LA-5 and LAGG-3 fighters, totaling several dozen aircraft. Our flight consisted of 4 fighters. Lieutenant Vaino Pokala's section had already engaged the formation when Ture Matala and I rolled in to strike. It was at that moment that I noticed another formation of LA-5 fighters above and behind us and diving into attack. Immediately I turned in towards this new threat, and Ture followed while he radioed a warning to Pakela's section about the additional enemy aircraft. Although the engagement had begun above the water, our section and our opponents had drifted over land. Pakela's engagement was still over water. I had an opportunity to shoot at one of the LA-5s from behind onto the side when it turned in front of me. Pieces broke off the aircraft and it began to stream thick smoke as it dived vertically through a hole in the clouds, passing Ture, who pulled up sharply. The fight had started at about 13,000 feet but had risen to 16,000 feet. The superior number of enemy aircraft had caused us to climb continually. In addition to the LA-5s, some LAGG-3s had joined the engagement, so there really were enough targets for the two of us. Ture had allowed an enemy fighter to get behind him and tried to dive into a cloud to shake off his attacker. At the time, I was behind an LA-5 which was performing an impressive program of aerobatics. When I saw the danger to my wingman, I broke away from my opponent and went to help Ture, calling to him to warn of the threat. I fired at Ture's attacker from long range, ahead of him, to get him to break off. My trick worked and the LAGG-3 broke away from Ture's tail, turning to attack me. I shot at it from behind and to the side, then he seemed to become confused and reversed his turn, thus allowing me to close to a better range. I noticed that there were a couple of enemy fighters above us, but concluded that they were not yet a threat. The LAGG-3 tried to shake me off its tail without success. I was now close enough to fire, at a range of about 20 yards. I squeezed off some short bursts and suddenly the target was in flames. Now 4 LA-5s attacked me and I pulled up into a tight climbing turn which the enemies could not follow with their high speed. 2 of the aircraft stayed above me and 2 were below and beside me. On the upper side of one of the upper section attacked. I turned down under its nose and then pulled up at full power even before it passed me. Simultaneously, I fired a short burst at the aircraft, still turning above me. My tracers didn't get very close to him and he dived under his comrade. 4 other enemy aircraft tried to attack me from above and behind in a steep diving turn. I pulled into a half loop and went via it into a vertical dive through a gap in the clouds and away from the scene. It began to get a little desolate for me, trying to wrestle 4 enemy aircraft over enemy territory, and more were expected to appear soon. The day's tally turned out to be 2 to my credit, as observed from a coastal post, and 1 for Pakila. So there you go. Now you know. The world's most successful fighter pilot was a Finn. Ilmari Juutilainen. Who'da funk it? Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.